I was born in a little town in Canada where it snowed a lot. For this reason, my parents decided to move to a cabin in a forest a few miles away from town. They took me and my siblings, consisting of me, my 3 brothers, 2 sisters, and a dog. I, being the second oldest, didn't really like the idea of living in the woods. My parents assured me that it will be wonderful, just us out here. It took us about 2 weeks to fully get settled in. As I was playing with my youngest brother, he asked me if I could read him a book. I said, "Sure, buddy, go ahead and pick one out." His smile could have lit the entire room up. He quickly shuffled over to his bookshelf, and despite him being 6 years old, he ignored all the picture books and went straight for a black pop-up book called The Man from the Window. Now, I don't remember ever seeing this book before, but I just thought that maybe our mom had gotten it for him. So I opened it up and began reading. The man from the window is sad. He couldn't find friends, so now he's mad. Late at night when there is no light, the man from the window will wrap you up tight. No need to scream or fight, because the man from the window has you all right. Be careful when you hear a tap, tap, tap. The pop-ups from this book were so disturbing. It showed the man from the window stuffing the child into a bag. Do you know how Krampus does that? It was just like how Krampus would do it. My brother seemed to enjoy the book as he begged me to read it again. I said, "No. I read you a book. I'm not reading you another one." Just then I heard a tapping sound coming from the window. I crept over there, my hair stood up on my neck and opened the window. It was day and I could see everything. Just then a snowball hit me in the face. "Stop being a pussy and come have a snowball fight," my brother Justin had said. I quickly put on my little brother's winter clothing and then mine, and we headed outside. It was already 3 o'clock, so we only had about an hour and a half until sunset. We played up until we saw the sun dip below the trees. Around 4:45, we started to head in. We got inside, took all of our stuff off, and sat down in the living room. About an hour later, our parents called us in for dinner. Everyone sat down, and our father began to say grace. "Dear Father, please bless this house." Just as he said that, the lights shut off. They quickly came on, and my father quickly finished, and we started to eat. Later, when we went to bed, I had a hard time falling asleep. My mom had told me it was most likely because of the new house. The tree outside my window was swaying with the wind going tap, tap, tap. I was thinking about the man from the window and how disturbing that book was. I then went to sleep. I woke up to my oldest brother violently shaking me. "Get the hell up," he yelled. I ran outside to see what the commotion was, and there, laying about 2 feet away from our porch, was our dog. Except, he was missing 2 legs and its head. Our dad rushed everyone inside and told everyone to calm down. He later called one of his co-workers down, and they took the dog to go bury it somewhere. "What the fuck happened to Otis?" my brother screamed. After an hour or 2, or however long it took for my dad to come back, he had said that a pack of wolves might have gotten him when he was outside last night. Everyone took that as their answer, as there was nothing else to think. It was awkward that night during dinner. No grace, no one talked. It probably only lasted 15 minutes, then everyone went to bed. I was heartbroken that our dog had died. Maybe I could have heard Otis scratching at the door if I wasn't thinking so much about the man from the window, I thought to myself. I later calmed down and said it wasn't anyone's fault Otis had died. It was just nature doing its thing. The next incident made me change my mind. 3 weeks had gone by since Otis's death, and everyone began to stop thinking about it. We all had a great time, laughing and having fun. We decided to watch a movie this night, so we stayed up awfully late. It was until 11 p.m. that we went to bed. That night, while I was sitting there just thinking, I heard a tap, tap, tap. I didn't think anything of it, but then I heard it again, only louder. Tap, tap, tap. I looked at my window, and nothing was there. I went back to bed and I heard it again, only this time in the hallway. I froze. I didn't know what to do. I was scared shitless. I then got back control of my body and slowly went towards the exit of my room. I slowly opened it to a crack and stared outside. There I saw a gray man, standing at about 7 feet tall, with a huge smile, one that could light up an entire room, leaving with a bag filled with stuff. The man and I stared at each other for about 5 seconds before he said, "Once I become bored with these friends, just like I became bored with that dog, I'll come back for you." I didn't sleep at all that night. I was hoping that it was a dream, but it wasn't. I had walked out of my room and there was not a single person in my house. I checked all of my family members' rooms and their doors were wide open. Their sheets made it look like they just got out of bed. I never saw my parents again, nor did I see the man from the window. I called my uncle and aunt that day, and of course they thought I was crazy. I moved out of that house since then and now live in a house out in Ohio. Whenever I hear a tap, 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 I always prepare myself for what's to come. I work for a small newspaper company and I usually just write about things happening in the community. One story, though, got me particularly interested, and it was about a woman who lived in filth. Her neighbors had been complaining about odd foul smells coming from her house. It isn't the type of story that I usually do, but it was different, and that's what got me interested. When I got to her house, I could clearly see from the front of the house how filthy it all was. The thought of going inside started to become a regrettable decision. I mean, first encounters count, right? And I didn't mean to be so judgmental straight away, but looking at her house, it gave off the sort of impression that this was a person who didn't look after herself that much. I also talked with some of the locals, and what they told me about her didn't give off a good judgment of character. This woman was clearly out of touch with everything around her. At the same time, I wanted to know more about her, and me being a nosy person, I couldn't help but wanting to know more about her. Clearly, something had happened in her life to make her live like this. I had already called her to make sure she was okay with me looking into her life, and she agreed to show me her way of life and to explain to me why she lives the way she does. The filth had a stench, and I was surprised that she hadn't died from any bacteria or virus, because it seemed like the right environment for bacteria and viruses to survive. Her mental state was questionable, and she had old cassette players and VHS players all over the place, which don't really exist anymore. When I asked her why she lived like this, all that she could tell me was that as long as filth smelled like the way it should, it was all good. Everything was a mess, and I don't know why, but it kind of all got me being grateful for all of the things I had in my life. On the other hand, I am sure someone with OCD would love to clean every speck of this place, and with everything out of order, it told me that her life must have been out of control. Things were broken, and she survived on government benefits and some inheritance from her parents. I could hear small things moving around, and they must have been rats or some other animal. It's weird how animals can survive in such mess. I guess their immune system must be better than ours. Actually, maybe this woman's immune system might be amazing at this point because she has survived this long in this mess. She then told me about her mother and father. She was brought up in a 5-bedroom house. She also had 2 younger siblings, and after she had told me that she had siblings, I quickly assumed that her siblings had wanted nothing to do with her, which I was gravely wrong about. I tried asking more questions about her upbringing, but all she told me was, "Just go to the house of my childhood and notice how the filth gives off an amazing aroma." I then went to her childhood home, and I could clearly see that it had been abandoned for many years, and Mother Nature had clearly took over the house. It's sad how houses begin to go under after they had been abandoned, and it reminded me of the only thing I had remembered in my sociology class before I changed courses to journalism. It's people that give meaning to buildings and materialistic things, not the object itself. I kicked the door down as I could clearly see that the front door was past its prime. From what the house looked like, I had expected odor and stench to hit my nose, but instead I got to smell the most amazing aroma I had ever smelt in my life. I then started searching her childhood home for anything interesting to find. This woman's childhood home was exactly like her own house, and I don't know why, but I started to become irritated by this woman. In my generation, we are finding it difficult to even buy a home, and even if someone from my generation has managed to somehow buy a home, it's hard to keep it maintained. Yet this woman has managed to live in a big childhood home, as well as having her own home, which clearly, she had decided to neglect it. It's unfair, but I guess life is just unfair. It was all a mess, and I was beginning to find it all predictable with the neglect of having any care or pride in one's own life. Maybe her parents were abusive, and I wondered more about her siblings, because now I wanted to know why she was so alone in the world. We all need someone, no matter who we are. But then again, loneliness is a big problem in Western civilization, and we even have someone in the government whose main job is to tackle things like loneliness. Loneliness becomes more apparent as we get older, and this woman was old now, and with the inventions of social media and computer games, it's made loneliness even more stronger. The only good but odd thing about this woman's childhood home is the nice aroma and smell. I decided to follow the aroma because I couldn't resist it anymore. The aroma could be smelt the most from behind the sofas, and you know how in cartoons when one cartoon character follows a pack of sweets all lined up because it was being set up? That's what happened to me. When I looked behind the sofas, I gasped with horror and with utter disbelief because I never thought that I would ever look upon something so disgusting and completely random. I saw 4 skeleton bones still giving off a perfume-like scent, and this is not the type of smell you would think death could give off. I mean, with an amazing smell present, you would think something was full of life to give such a scent. I went back to see the woman, and I didn't call the police just yet, because I wanted to know more, and I wanted her permission first of how to proceed with everything that I had just found. When I told this woman of filth of what I had experienced in her childhood home, she started tearing up. Instead of calling the police, she just turned on the VHS player and I started to watch something like an explanation video. At the same time, I also have to shamefully admit that as a journalist writer, finding all of this would have progressed my career in the journalism world. Even though I had just found something terrible, my career coming to my mind showed how I could have profited from this. Anyhow, the video told me more things about what was really going on. Hello, my name is Dr. Rogerson Peak. I have invented a pill that could make any dead person smell nice. When a body starts decomposing, it usually starts to smell. But with this pill, a decomposing body will be the most sweet-smelling thing you have ever smelled. The cassette player kept on playing. After watching the whole video, a few thoughts came to mind. Yes, the pill would give the dead person a bit more dignity by smelling nice, and it will also help people who deal with dead bodies like in hospitals. But at the same time, this might be a great advantage for a murderer or serial killer. Imagine someone had murdered someone in your home, but the murdered person had this pill before being murdered. It could be sometime before you notice something is off. Something smelling nice usually doesn't give an image of death or tell you that something is decomposing. It's always the nasty smell which makes us think something is off. Like when I was in this woman's childhood home, I honestly didn't think I would find something to be dead. Do you see how this might be an advantage for a serial killer or murderer? And I started to understand why this woman lived like the way she lived now for such a long time. I felt bad for being so judgmental, or for thinking about my career gain off this whole story. I also started glue together who those skeletons belonged to. From common sense, those skeletons behind the sofa in her childhood home must have been her 2 parents and 2 siblings, and I thought they had just abandoned her because of the way she had lived her life. Is someone trying to kill you? I asked this woman. My whole family took part in the experiment to eat the pill. We were struggling for money at the time, and they promised us that they would pay us lots of money to eat the pill. They weren't 100% honest with us, and none of us knew what the pill was made for exactly. She told me. She started crying a little bit, and the more I understood her story and why she lived the way she did, it was sad, just so sad. How we humans can be so unsympathetic or not care enough to understand someone, but rather to just judge and cast aside. After taking the pill, one midnight someone broke into my home, and I was just a child back then, and this man had murdered my mother, father, and both my siblings. I hid in a secret wall cupboard in my room which my father had built. For weeks, this strange man who broke into my house observed my whole family's dead bodies. They all started to smell nice as they decomposed. I overheard his talk on the phone, and they wanted to use this pill in war and other scenarios where death is common. But they wanted to hide the deaths and murders. If something smells nice, no one would ever think something has died, she explained to me. She managed to escape when the strange man went for a smoke in her garden, and I couldn't believe what I had just been told. This story was not just a story, but probably one of the biggest scandals in the 21st century. I had to write about this and get this story out, and I phoned the police about the 4 skeletons in this woman's childhood home. Something had to be done, and we all know how shady the government can be and some of the things they can be capable of. This woman deserved justice. I hugged her and she pleaded me not to go to the police, but obviously I decided to go against her word. I went back to my flat, and as soon as I entered, a beautiful scented aroma hit my nose, but I never sprayed anything inside my flat recently. I checked my whole flat and I found a dead body in my bathtub. The dead body had a note attached to it which read, "Be wary of your steps, lad." I straightaway drove to the woman's house, and this time, instead of the scent of filth hitting my nose, it was a perfume-like aroma, and I knew she had been murdered in her own living room. There was a note on her body which read, "We are watching and the dead body in your flat has been taken now," and I couldn't believe it. I checked her childhood home and everything inside had been taken and no sign of police of any kind. They knew I would check on this woman after finding a dead body in my apartment as well as her childhood home. I am being watched now. My dad was my hero. I idolized that man growing up. No matter what got him down or problems he was struggling with, he always had a smile on his face for me. I think that's the reason why what happened doesn't make any sense to me. My mom was also great. At heart, I was a complete mommy boy and always have been. I would do anything to make sure she was happy. One day, something changed in her. She seemed withdrawn, as if something was troubling her. I overheard her one night talking to my nan on the phone. I'm sure she suspected my dad of cheating on her, something I think would be unforgivable. She complained to my nan about a strange odor coming from his clothes. I didn't want to believe it. Maybe he was just working harder than usual. I decided it would be best if I confronted him. Maybe I thought I could handle the truth better than my mother could. I think I just needed to know for myself. My mom was cooking dinner while I sat at the table waiting. My dad, who was normally never late for dinner, was now over an hour late. As we ate, I could see my mom glance over at the empty plate where my dad would sit and then glance up at the clock. I kept my mouth shut about it because I didn't want to embarrass my mom by telling her I knew what was going on. He was over 2 hours late before he finally snuck in the back door. As I went to get up from the table, he glanced at me with a nervous smile before he disappeared down into the basement. This wasn't something my dad did, and now I was sure something wasn't right. As I made my way down the narrow steps into the basement, I began to get that unusual smell I heard my mother talk about. It was hard to describe. It smelt like the crusty old sock behind my bed that my mom was scared to touch, and the musty odor that only comes from an old folks' home. As I slowly made my way down the stairs, I could hear my dad on the phone crying uncontrollably, begging someone for forgiveness. I made it to the last step, forgetting that it made a loud creak. When it alerted my dad to my presence, the usual bright smile he kept for me was replaced with a hate-filled glare. He bore his teeth at me like a rabid dad before he made a lunge for me. He was too quick for me to react and caught me by the scruff of my jumper. The anger on his face terrified me to my core. I didn't recognize my father at that moment, but the look of fear on my face snapped him back to his senses, and he wrapped his arms around me, as if ashamed of what just happened. As he held me, he looked down at the phone in his other hand. I could swear I could hear someone laughing loudly on the other end, and without warning, my dad stopped hugging me before slithering back into the dark corner of the basement, sobbing down the down. The next day, I followed my dad to work. I sat in the coffee shop across from the building he worked in, waiting for him to finish. As I sat there, I prayed my dad was cheating. I prayed that whatever the reason for my dad's behavior was something that made sense. I sat and watched as he left for home. He was on the phone with that same disturbed look he had down the basement. He would glance down at his watch as he went in the opposite direction of home. I knew I had to keep following him, but I was terrified of what I was going to discover. He was on the phone the whole time I followed. I followed for about 20 minutes until he came to a rundown, dilapidated house. All I could think about was my distraught mother at home wondering about her husband as he walked up the steps to the house. I watched as my father let himself into the house. I walked nervously up to the steps of the house. It was now or never, and I was determined to get to the bottom of this. If I had to, I was going to catch him in the act. I wasn't going to give him the chance to talk himself out of it. I walked up to the door and banged on the knocker as hard and angrily as I could. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for someone to open the door before I decided to move around to the back of the house. As I passed one of the windows around the back, something glanced my eye in one of the downstairs windows. To my complete horror, it was my dad sitting on a chair in an empty room. He looked terrified and was crying uncontrollably. I banged on the window trying to get his attention, but he completely ignored me. I could see him looking at something, and whatever it was, he looked horrified. I couldn't understand why he didn't get up and run. He wasn't tied to the chair or bound in any way, and for some reason he was in his bare feet. As I screamed for him to move, I suddenly saw what my dad was looking at. Whatever it was, it crawled towards him. It moved unnaturally as it dragged itself slowly across the floor. The thing almost looked human, but with long hair that covered parts of its skeletal, naked body. It kept moving towards my dad. He looked so scared as it edged itself closer to him. The closer it got, the more my dad cried. I tried breaking the window, but the rocks just bounced off it. My dad seemed resigned to his fate as it inched closer. The creature sniffed the ground as if it was trying to find something, but stopped when it got to my dad's feet. My dad didn't look scared anymore as the creature started licking his feet. He laughed uncontrollably as the creature's long, slimy, snake-like tongue slithered all over my dad's feet. The more the creature licked my dad's feet, the more he laughed. He laughed so much he began pissing himself as it got too much for him. I was sure my dad was going to laugh himself to death. As I stood there helplessly, I noticed someone else in the room. They looked small like a child, but old and creepy at the same time. They seemed to be telling whatever was on the floor what to do and got into a manic frenzy. The more the creature licked my dad's feet. I couldn't hear what was going on, but suddenly a little girl walked into the room. The old creepy-looking child seemed physically scared of the little girl and backed away into the corner of the room. She walked over to my dad and began collecting his tears in a small glass vial. It was killing me seeing my father like this, and I didn't understand why he didn't just get up and run. I was trying to think of a plan to get my dad from the house when suddenly I got that same smell I got from my dad in the basement. Before I could turn to see where the smell was coming from, something hit me in the head and my lights went out. When I finally came to, it was dark out and the house seemed empty. I made my way home hoping to find my dad there, and maybe everything I had witnessed was just some horrible dream. When I made it home, I was surprised to see the light on in the kitchen. As I opened the kitchen door, I was hit with that horrible smell again. The smell was pungent, but this time it wasn't my dad. It was my mother, and she was huddled under the table with the same distraught look on her face my father had. She was on the phone crying hysterically and apologizing down the phone to someone. I quickly grabbed the phone from her hand and demanded whoever was on the other end to tell me who it was. The sound of a little girl's voice was laughing down the phone at me. As I begged them to leave us alone, the phone suddenly went quick. Suddenly, the girl spoke in an eerie manner of urgency. "Your mother's tears are going to taste so much sweeter than your father's." My father was a deeply terrifying human being when growing up. He never hit us, but he went out of his way to scare us into compliance. Not by using threats, but by doing strange things like hiding under our bed, making noises at night, and then telling us that it was the monster that ate children who wouldn't go to sleep. I had an older brother who had a habit of sneaking downstairs at night for food, which would make my dad furious. The entrance to our attic was right outside our bedroom door, and one night my dad took the wooden cover off and placed a terrifying Halloween mask looking down into the hall, and told us it was the attic demon waiting to grab our souls if we dared to walk past it at night. I had to hand it to my dad because it bloody worked, and my brother would be too terrified to even open the bedroom door at night. By the time I was in my teens, I think the worst thing he ever told us was that if we ever tried to sneak out at night, the monsters that lived in the house would be so angry they would kill him and our mother, and we would come back to find them hanging dead from the tree in our backyard. All I knew was fear at night growing up, and I think it had impacted me as an adult. I hate sleeping so much that if I could live my life without it, I would. My sleep troubles got worse when my dad died, and I moved back home to be a presence in the house for my mother. I'd often tried talking to my mother about the tricks Dad played on us as kids, but I suspected the mind games my dad played on my mom were a lot worse. When he died, she never really shed tears for him, and she almost looked relieved when he was lowered into the ground during his funeral. All she would say was that the stories he told us growing up became his nightmare, and if you say something enough, it becomes a reality you can't escape from. I had lived out of state and didn't have much contact with the family. The circumstances around my dad's death were unexpected. He hung himself from the tree he told us he would be found hanging from if we tried to sneak out. I had been back to sleeping in the room I shared with my brother as a kid. The anxiety started the same night I began hearing noises under the bed. It brought back memories of the noises my dad would make when he hid there trying to scare us. This went on for weeks, and every time I began to drift off. I didn't give it much thought and believed it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Then one night, the noises turned to whispers, like someone under my bed whispering to themselves. My anxiety then turned to paralyzing fear when I heard the name Buster creep from the darkness of the room. It was a name I hadn't been called since I last saw my father. It was the nickname my dad would call me when he wasn't trying to terrify me. I lay there too frozen to move as the whispers turned to a loud taunt. "Buster, Buster, it's me, Buster." As the taunting continued, I pulled myself together enough to plant my feet on the bedroom floor. I inched down slowly to look under the bed when I suddenly heard my dad's voice permeate from under the bed. "Remember what will happen to you if you move from the bed?" Suddenly, a deathly cold hand grabbed me by my ankle and I let out a blood-curdling scream. I felt like that same scared child who would lie in bed every night praying the monsters wouldn't get. I screamed until the lights of my bedroom suddenly switched on, and my mother was standing in the doorway of my bedroom looking at me as if I had gone crazy. Maybe I am crazy, I thought to myself the following night, as I tried once again to get some sleep. As I lay there, the thought of the cold hand grabbing my leg plagued my mind. As the familiar feeling of dread crept up my spine, a different sound caught my attention. This time it came from above, like something being dragged along the floor in the attic. I could hear footsteps pacing back and forth across the ceiling. It was then I remembered what my dad would tell my brother about demons in the attic. As an adult, it wouldn't be something to think twice about, but the fear that now gripped my soul had me doubting everything. I decided to go check the attic door outside my room. I prayed to God that the wooden cover was still in place, but to my horror, the attic was wide open. My heart was racing as I peered into the darkness. The pitch blackness of the attic was playing tricks on my mind as it morphed into grotesque shapes. Suddenly, a pair of glowing red eyes peered out from the darkness. Maybe my dad never got rid of that terrible Halloween mask, I thought to myself as I grabbed a chair from my room. As I pulled myself into the dark abyss of the attic, I felt something brush past me. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see a figure huddled in the corner. For a moment, I thought it was the darkness playing tricks on me until the sound of crying jolted me back to reality. The crying got louder as I got closer, and as my eyes adjusted more to the darkness, my heart began to race as the figure in the corner looked like my father. "Dad? Dad, is that you?" I reluctantly called out. I couldn't believe what I was saying. As I got closer, the crying got louder. I began to shake uncontrollably as I reached out my hand to touch whoever was crying in the corner. Suddenly, my fear turned to a strange relief when my brother turned to me with red, tearful eyes. "What the hell are you doing up here, Mike? This is weird even for you." Mike had a confused look on his face. He looked around the attic as if seeing it for the first time. "I was having a terrible dream about Dad." I was even more confused as my brother lives about 5 miles from the house and rarely visits. Mike looked at me again as he began to come around to his senses. He seemed even more confused than me. How did I get here? The last thing I remember was lying in bed thinking about how Dad died. After everything had calmed down, we sat at the kitchen table reminiscing about our childhood. We talked about all the terrible things Dad did to us as kids, trying to make sense of everything. "Do you think it's strange how Dad died? I mean, why did he want to kill himself?" None of it made sense to me either. Although my dad was strange, he never seemed sad enough to want to kill himself. When he wasn't trying to scare us into compliance, he wasn't the worst dad. I mean, there were a few good moments, a few good memories. As we continued to talk, our mom came into the kitchen. She looked glad to see her 2 boys sitting at the table like we did when we were kids. "My 2 wonderful boys," she said, as she draped her arms over our shoulders. Mike looked at our mom as if she would have all the answers. "What was Dad doing by the tree that night, Mom?" I could feel my mom's body tense up as the words left my brother's mouth. "Some things aren't worth dwelling on. Your father was a complicated man. The past is the past, and that is where we're going to leave it." My mother was always great at sidestepping the truth. Emotions were not her strong point, but I suspect it was a defense she had built up to deal with my dad. When I was younger, I remember walking into the living room and my dad was waving a gun about while my mom begged him to stop. I remember the fear in her face. Maybe I was too young to realize what was happening. But now I'm beginning to think she had it a lot worse. A few days had passed and my anxiety seemed to be getting worse. Sleeping seemed like an impossibility. The thoughts of it filled me with unbearable dread. My heart was beating to the sound of the ticking clock on the wall when suddenly the sound under my bed returned. The scratching and knocking came in turns like it was trying to get my attention. I put it down to my mind still playing tricks. I needed to see for myself that I was just imagining it. As I bent down to look under my bed, I heard my father's voice again. This time it was loud and clear. "Buster, I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to leave your mother." As my dad's voice rang in my ear, I peered under the bed. I didn't know what to believe when I saw my dad staring back at me. His face was all twisted. My body went numb with fear as he reached out to me. "Buster," he called out again as he tried to crawl towards me. "Look out the window. Save me, Buster." I jumped up on the bed as my dad's face came within inches of mine. I looked out the window to the lonely oak tree that sat in the center of the back garden. A different kind of fear gripped my body as I watched my mother placing a nose around her neck. I screamed and banged on the window to get her attention. She looked at me with a sort of relief on her face, like all the pain she had felt was going to come to an end. My brain was swirling as I ran to the garden. I grabbed her legs as I pleaded with her not to die. Her face was already blue as I looked for something to cut her down. I fumbled about in a panic for what felt like hours. I tried everything to save her, but eventually it was too late. Later that night, after the cops and paramedics were finished with their inquiries, I sat alone in my mom's bedroom, contemplating how everything had gone so wrong. What will I tell Mike? I thought to myself before spotting a note on the dresser. The note was made out to myself and Mike. I could barely read what was written on it through the tears in my eyes. "To my beautiful boys, I tried my best to protect you growing up. I tried to shield you from the scary nightmares your father tried to fill your head with, and I feel like I failed you. When he wasn't dreaming up monsters to scare you, he was dreaming up demons to scare me. He held me captive through fear of being left to bring you boys up alone. He used the threat of suicide to keep me trapped. The night he died, I called his bluff and gave him the final push. He begged me to save him, but I turned my back until he was gone. I wish everything could have been different. But now we are all free." Her name was Eloise Winters, and she was the most beautiful human being I had ever seen. And she was kind, so kind. But most of all, she was the only person I'll ever love. And the day she died was the day I started living. When I first met her, I was just going through the motions. My job as a nurse was tiring, and I dreaded every night having to wake up and going there. That changed when she came into the IR that afternoon. Because Eloise was the reason my soul started to smile again. It wasn't a busy day like most days were, so when I called out her name at my desk, I took my time. I didn't bother to look up from the PC when I asked her to explain her emergency. When she spoke, she sounded like 1,000 symphonies, and I just had to see the face that made this angelic sound. Her light blonde hair was shimmering in the sunlight like golden thread in a fairy tale. Her heavenly blue eyes met mine, and she said, "I think I broke my left arm." Blood flushed to my head and made my face red. I just nodded and took notes. I was speechless, but mustered up the courage to assure her that the doctor would be there shortly. That evening, before I went home, I snuck into her files, found her contact information, and started to come up with an excuse for using them. I went in my car, but let my mind do the driving, and suddenly I was at the Earth Angel's house. I wanted to knock on her door so bad, but I couldn't. Instead, I just sat in my car outside her house. I sat there until the sun came up, and then I sat there some more. In fact, I sat there for so long, I didn't got to work. I must have been dozing of, because I jolted awake by the sound of a door slamming. Her front door. I looked at my watch and it was way past midnight. I had 7 missed calls from work, but I turned off my phone. Eloise walked past my seemingly unnoticeable car and went down the road. I got out and followed her. I don't know why, I just couldn't help it. It was as if I wasn't in control of my body. We walked for about 10 minutes when we came to an abandoned factory building that had a large entry with hinges and locks on it. Even though it was pitch black out and no one except me was around, she didn't seem at all scared. She walked around the building, and while I hid in a bush, I heard knocking and a screech as the door she knocked on opened. She went inside and I followed shortly after. My mind was racing and my heart felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. Why is this beautiful creature here all alone? I thought to myself and went inside. I shouldn't have followed. I shouldn't have lurked. I should have been at home in my bed after a day's work, but I loved her the moment words came out of her mouth formed by her rose-red lips. So I had to follow. I had to lurk because I had to have her and to hold her for all eternity. The old factory building smelled like urine and worse, and I almost gagged. Eloise went down a dark corridor and entered a large room. As I hid behind a pillar, I observed people in the back of the room. There were candles illuminating their spot, and I saw they had mattresses, blankets, a hot plate, and stuff like that. They seemed to be a family. 2 kids, both girls at about 6 to 8 years old, and a woman and a man. I hadn't noticed until now the shoulder bag Eloise was wearing. She took a brown paper bag out of it and handed it to the couple. I heard them thank her profusely and saw them give her a hug. My stomach turned and I felt sort of jealous. I was still hiding when the love of my life went back out into the night. Before I followed, I saw the family take some cans and stuff out of the paper bag. Eloise, that amazing being, had brought them food. I told you she was kind. I followed her home and was just about to go back to my car when Eloise went inside her house without locking her door. I know this because after she closed it, I had my ear pinned up to it in hopes of hearing her voice again. I just stood there, again speechless, and at last I went ever so gently inside, not making even the slightest sound. I heard water running. She was in the shower. Can you imagine the feelings I felt knowing that my soulmate was naked and wet with hot steaming water? I knew I should have gone home. I knew I shouldn't have peeked. But I just couldn't help myself. I had to see her the way God created her. I had to touch her naked and without a doubt soft skin. So I went into her bathroom, quietly. I wanted to pull the shower curtain aside, but I couldn't. Instead, I found her bedroom, and I climbed into her bed and waited, and then I waited some more. Daylight arrived and she still wasn't next to me. The water was still running. I had to check on her. I couldn't have something happen to her, not before I could get my hands on her. On the bathroom floor laid my beautiful Eloise, blood running slowly out of her head like melting butter on a piece of toast. She wasn't breathing. I was going to call an ambulance anonymously, but I still felt like I would have a problem explaining why I was in her home since I was a mere stranger. So I turned on my phone again, and her laptop, which didn't have a password, it must have been fate, found her Facebook and sent her a friend request from my phone. I accepted it from her computer, and then I wrote some messages between us on Messenger. I made them sound romantic, like we had that relationship we were meant to, but I got way into it and time flew by. I didn't bother eating or drinking or even going to the toilet, and then I realized that it had been 2 whole days. I didn't care, though. I kept on writhing messages between us, building up our love and life and intern jokes, and I didn't stop until I felt the cold steel from the handcuffs the police put around my wrists. I screamed and cried, but they were brutal and didn't care. They eventually found that the cause of death was a slip and fall. Eloise had hit her head and died. Her surveillance cameras showed me laying in her bed the moment she fell and died. They didn't let me go because they said I had been defiling her corpse. That couldn't be further from the truth. I made love to my Eloise, and that is not disgusting. It's the most beautiful thing in the world. Also, I got charged with breaking in, stalking, and for waiting too long to contact law enforcement. They said I couldn't go to prison. They said I was dangerous. Nonsense. But now I'm here in the asylum. They give me pills 3 times a day. I hide them under my tongue like I hid under Eloise's blankets and spit them out when the nurse leave. To say I won't get out for a very long time. But I know where her body is buried, and when I get out I will make love to my sweet angel again. Until then I can make plenty ado with her pinky finger that they did see me cut off her, but didn't see me swallow.